As the situation in Venezuela has continued to develop, it's become clear to me that what is actually happening diverges very significantly from the official narrative. And if you give me a chance to actually display the details, you'll see this is not a hard conclusion to come to. On January 3, 2026, United States Special Forces launched a raid in Caracas and captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. He was flown to New York to face charges of narco-trafficking. For many, this moment felt like the end of a long, painful story. The story of a nation destroyed by a corrupt dictator and crippled by foreign sanctions. You've heard that story. It's the simple, political, feel-good story that most of us want to believe. But as it turns out, it's not the real story. The truth is far more complex, and in many ways, far more terrifying. The test of a justification is not whether it sounds reasonable. The test is whether it's factually true. And the reality is, the collapse of Venezuela wasn't just the result of one dictator or a set of sanctions. It was a slow-motion economic crime that started half a century ago. This isn't just the story of a failed state, it's a blueprint for how any nation, even a rich one, can rot from the inside out. And it started not with a sanction or a protest, but with a fatal addiction, an addiction to oil.
Section 1. The Golden Cage. An addiction is born. Now, to understand how it all went so wrong, you first have to understand how right it once seemed. In the 1970s, Venezuela was nicknamed Saudi Venezuela. It was the richest country in Latin America, and by some measures, one of the 20th wealthiest nations on Earth. Its per capita income was higher than Spain's or Israel's. The capital, Caracas, was a glittering hub of modern architecture and high fashion, all of it fueled by a seemingly endless gusher of black gold. This all started back in 1922 with the discovery of vast oil reserves under Lake Maracaibo. By the late 1920s, Venezuela was the world's largest oil exporter. This geological lottery ticket funded everything. It paid for social programs, infrastructure, and a strong currency that made imported goods cheap and plentiful. But this prosperity was a facade. It was a golden cage. All of the wealth was entirely dependent on a single commodity whose price was decided thousands of miles away. This phenomenon has a name: Dutch disease. When one resource, in this case oil, is so profitable, it makes a country's currency incredibly strong. That sounds good on the surface, but it has a devastating side effect. It makes everything else the country produces too expensive to sell to the rest of the world. Farming, manufacturing, textiles, all the traditional pillars of a healthy, diversified economy were crowded out. It was just cheaper to import food and cars with petrodollars than to make them at home. The country stopped learning how to do anything else. It became a nation that did only one thing: pump oil. This was Venezuela's original sin. It's an addiction that felt wonderful during the high of booming oil prices in the 1970s, but left the country dangerously vulnerable. It's like a lottery winner who stops going to work, sells their tools, and just assumes the winnings will last forever. But as it turns out, they never do. And while the money flowed, a deep, corrosive problem was taking root. The foundation for the collapse was being laid, not from foreign enemies, but from within.
Section 2. The Blueprint for Collapse. The Internal Crimes. The story of Venezuela's implosion is really a story of three catastrophic, self-inflicted wounds. These are the economic crimes that truly destroyed the nation long before the harshest sanctions were ever conceived. Crime number 1, the Great Siphon, a culture of corruption. The idea that corruption in Venezuela started with Hugo Chavez or Nicolas Maduro is a convenient fiction. The reality is that oil wealth and corruption grew up together like two sides of the same coin. From the 1970s onward, the state-owned oil company Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., or PDVSA, was treated less like a national asset and more like a private slush fund for the political elite. During the oil booms of the 70s and 80s, rampant graft became the norm. One analysis estimates that a staggering $100 billion was embezzled between 1972 and 1997 alone. This was the money that should have been saved for a rainy day, the money that should have built new industries. Instead, it vanished into foreign bank accounts. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he promised to end this, but instead he supercharged it. Riding a wave of record-high oil prices, his government unleashed a level of corruption the country had never seen. Jorge Giordani, Chavez's own long-serving planning minister, would later allege that an unbelievable $300 billion was stolen during the Chavez era alone. This wasn't just skimming off the top. This was a systematic gutting of the nation's wealth by the very people sworn to protect it. And that led directly to the second crime.
Crime number 2, the purge, nationalization and incompetence. For its first 25 years, PDVSA was a rare success story. It was run like a private multinational with a culture of meritocracy. A year before Chavez took power, it was producing 3.2 million barrels of oil per day. But that professionalism made it a threat to Chavez's political project. In 2002, PDVSA workers went on strike. Chavez's response was swift and brutal. Appearing on television, he blew a referee's whistle and declared the company's management offside. What followed was a devastating purge. It's reported that nearly 19,000 PDVSA employees, almost 40% of the entire workforce, were fired. They were replaced not by people with experience, but by party loyalists. The institutional knowledge and technical expertise needed to run one of the world's most complex industries were wiped out almost overnight. Think about it with an analogy. It's like a world-class bakery that fires all its master bakers and replaces them with loyal friends who have never touched flour, and then acts surprised when the shelves are empty. The results were predictable. Production, which had peaked at over 3.5 million barrels of oil in the late 90s, began a long, steady decline. Starved of investment, maintenance, and expertise, the machinery began to break down. The golden goose was being starved to death, not by outside forces, but by its new owners. This was an act of economic suicide committed a decade and a half before the word sanctions entered the popular narrative.
Crime 3. The unraveling, price controls, and the death of production. The third crime was born from a policy that, on the surface, sounds benevolent, making essential goods affordable for everyone. In 2003, the government introduced a sweeping system of price controls on everything from milk to car batteries, alongside strict currency controls. The intention may have been to fight inflation, but the result was economic poison. Think about it from the perspective of a farmer. If the government decrees that you must sell a bag of rice for $1, but it costs you $2 to produce it, what do? You don't sell it at a loss, you simply stop growing rice. Now, apply that logic to every producer in the country. Thousands of firms and millions of hectares of land were driven out of business. The government crippled the entire domestic non-oil economy. Businesses shut down, investment vanished. Venezuela, a country with fertile land, became almost completely dependent on imports for its food. For a while, the government could mask this problem by using its dwindling petrodollars to import everything. But the shortages were already starting. By 2014, before the big oil price crash, shelves were already becoming intermittently empty. The country was no longer producing wealth, it was simply consuming what was left of it. It was a house of cards, and a gust of wind was coming.
Section 3.
The implosion. For years, the government had been balancing on a knife's edge, sustained only by high oil prices. In mid-2014, that knife edge disappeared. The global price of oil, which had been comfortably over $100 a barrel, collapsed, plunging to under $30 by early 2016. For a country getting over 90% of its export income from oil, this was a death blow. The revenue spigot that had papered over every bad decision was slammed shut. A well-managed country would have been prepared. It would have had a sovereign wealth fund, massive savings from the boom years. Norway did this. Venezuela did not. Its savings had been stolen or squandered. A diversified economy would have had other industries to fall back on. Venezuela did not. It had systematically destroyed them. Faced with this catastrophic loss of income and massive deficits, the government had only one tool left in its depleted toolbox: the printing press. To cover its bills, the Central Bank of Venezuela began printing bolívares with reckless abandon. It was a desperate attempt to create wealth out of thin air, an economic sin that has led to ruin every single time it has been tried. And so began one of the most vicious episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. It's not just prices going up, it's the total, terrifying annihilation of value. Imagine your life savings being worth half as much tomorrow as it is today. Now imagine that happening every single day for years. The currency ceased to be a store of value. It became a hot potato you had to spend the instant you received it before it lost its worth.
The numbers are so extreme, they become abstract. By 2016, the annual inflation rate hit 800%. By 2017, it was over 4,000%. At its peak in early 2019, the year-on-year inflation rate reached a mind-numbing 344,509%. Prices were doubling every few weeks. Money became meaningless. People took to weighing stacks of cash instead of counting them. Artists began weaving worthless banknotes into crafts and handbags to sell as souvenirs. To deal with the absurdity of paying millions of bolívares for a cup of coffee, the government simply lopped zeros off the currency. In 2018, they cut 5 zeros, creating the Bolívar Soberano. By 2021, that too was worthless, so they cut 6 more zeros. In total, they removed 14 zeros from the currency, a ghost of a number, representing an unimaginable destruction of wealth. The consequences for human life were apocalyptic. The economy, already in recession, went into freefall. Between 2014 and 2016 alone, it shrank by a staggering 24.3%. By 2021, the country's GDP had contracted by roughly 75% from its 2014 peak, a larger peacetime economic collapse than the United States experienced during the Great Depression. The price controls, once meant to make things affordable, now ensured nothing was available at all. The infamous Maduro diet became a grim national joke for the rapid, unintentional weight loss spreading across the nation. A 2017 study found that the average Venezuelan had lost 19 pounds in the previous year due to severe food scarcity. People were literally starving, resorting to eating from garbage trucks and hunting for scraps. Public services, the basic pillars of a modern society, disintegrated. Hospitals, once among the best in the region, became places of horror. Doctors and nurses were forced to work without medicine, without gloves, without cleaning supplies, without reliable electricity or running water. Patients died from routine infections. Infant and maternal mortality rates skyrocketed. Diseases like malaria and measles, once nearly eradicated, came roaring back. Then, in March 2019, the neglect culminated in a series of catastrophic nationwide blackouts. For days, and in some areas weeks, the entire country was plunged into darkness. Food rotted in refrigerators, water pumps failed, and hospital patients on life support died. It was a complete systems failure, a society shutting down in real time.
And then came the Exodus. Facing hunger, disease, and a complete breakdown of society, Venezuelans began to flee in one of the largest displacement crises in the world. They're called los caminantes, the walkers.
Millions of people, teachers, engineers, laborers, entire families left with nothing but what they could carry, trekking hundreds or thousands of miles on foot through the Andes into Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. By 2024, it was estimated that nearly 8 million people, more than a quarter of the entire population, had abandoned their homeland. This wasn't a migration. It was the evacuation of a dying country. The collapse of a currency is a terrifying spectacle, but understanding the hidden forces of money and inflation is one of the most critical skills you can have. If you want to get smarter about the unfiltered financial truths that shape our world, take a moment to subscribe. I try to break down the complex stories that others won't so you can see how the world really works. Section 4. The verdict. What about the sanctions? And so we arrive at the great deception, the central lie, the story that you have almost certainly been told, that this entire, sprawling human catastrophe was the fault of one thing and one thing only: United States sanctions. It's an incredibly potent narrative, isn't it? It's simple, it's clean, and it fits neatly into a prepackaged worldview. It provides a clear villain and a clear victim. It reduces a decade of complex internal decay into a straightforward story of foreign aggression. This simplicity is what makes the narrative so powerful and so useful. For a government desperate to deflect blame, and for outside observers reluctant to examine uncomfortable truths, it is the perfect explanation. It feels right. But the test of an explanation is not whether it feels right. The test is whether it is factually true. And a simple look at the timeline reveals the lie for what it is. To blame the sanctions for Venezuela's collapse is to willingly, deliberately ignore the entire sequence of the disaster. It is like arriving at a crime scene, seeing a man with a dozen stab wounds who has been dead for 3 days, and then blaming the coroner who shows up on the 4th day for the murder.
Let's be forensic. Let's look at the facts and the timeline, not the political spin. The first truly meaningful U.S. financial sanctions, the ones that began to restrict the government's ability to borrow money, were imposed in August of 2017. Let that date sink in. August 2017. Now, let's ask the critical question. What did Venezuela look like in August of 2017? Was it a thriving, healthy nation that was suddenly struck down? The evidence we have already discussed is overwhelming and undeniable. By August 2017, the Venezuelan economy had been trapped in a deep, punishing recession for 12 consecutive quarters. That's 3 straight years of economic decline. The nation's GDP had already shrunk by over 30%. Hyperinflation was not a future threat. It was already a present reality, destroying savings and terrorizing the population. The exodus of its people, the single greatest indicator of a failed state, was well underway. The Maduro diet was already a grim national punchline for widespread hunger. The hospitals were already beginning their descent into horror. The country was already breaking down. The disease was already in a terminal stage. Now let's move forward on the timeline. The truly crippling sanctions, the ones that targeted the state oil company, PDVSA, and effectively blocked Venezuela from exporting its oil to its primary market, were not implemented until January of 2019. Again, let's pause and paint a picture of the nation by that point. By January 2019, the Venezuelan economy was a corpse. The house had already burned down. The economic contraction had surpassed 50% from its peak in 2013. Oil production, the nation's supposed lifeline, had already plummeted, not because of sanctions, but because of the years of corruption, incompetence, and the purge of skilled workers we detailed earlier. Millions of people, the caminantes, had already fled the country on foot. The hyperinflation had reached its most absurd, mind-bending peaks, rendering the currency utterly useless. The nation was already dark, hungry, and broken. This is why the coroner analogy is so fitting. The sanctions were the autopsy report on an economy that was already dead. The report was brutal. It confirmed the death and perhaps even made it impossible for any miracle resuscitation to occur. But it did not commit the murder. The murder weapons had been deployed years earlier.
A better analogy might be that of a house on fire.
The kindling for the fire was laid in the 1970s, with the nation's fatal addiction to oil and hollowing out of every other industry. The logs were stacked throughout the 80s and 90s, with a culture of systemic corruption that siphoned away the nation's wealth. The match was struck in the early 2000s, with two catastrophic decisions: the political purge of the state oil company, which destroyed its competence, and the introduction of suicidal price controls, which destroyed the nation's ability to produce its own goods. The inferno was truly raging by mid-2014 when the oil price crashed and the government, out of options, turned to the printing press, unleashing hyperinflation. The house was already engulfed in flames. So what were the sanctions? The sanctions were gasoline poured on the fire. They were an accelerant. They absolutely, unequivocally made a horrific humanitarian crisis even worse. They made the flames burn hotter, faster, and more destructively. They were a brutal, punishing policy that inflicted immense suffering on ordinary people who were already suffering. Let there be no confusion on that point. Acknowledging that the sanctions were harmful and that they exacerbated the pain is not a defense of the policy. It is simply an honest observation. But an accelerant cannot start a fire. Gasoline poured on a cold pile of wood does nothing. It needs a pre-existing flame. To focus only on the gasoline is to ignore the arsonists who built the pyre and lit the match. It allows the very architects of the disaster to point their fingers at the fire department and scream that they are the ones at fault. It is a stunningly effective act of misdirection. Let's conduct a simple thought experiment. Imagine that the sanctions of 2017 and 2019 never happened. What would the Venezuela of 2019 have looked like? Based on the trajectory we have established, would it have been a paradise? Of course not. The government was already printing money at an exponential rate. The oil industry was already in a state of terminal collapse from a lack of maintenance and expertise. The country was already unable to feed itself because its farms and factories had been bankrupted by price controls. Without sanctions, the implosion still would have happened. It was mathematically, economically inevitable. Perhaps the final collapse would have taken 6 months longer, or a year. Perhaps the government would have been able to sell its last few barrels of oil to delay the final, complete shutdown. But the destination was the same. The ship was already taking on water from a dozen holes ripped in its hull from the inside. The sanctions were just a wave that crashed over a vessel that was already sinking.
To blame the sanctions is therefore to absolve the true culprits. It is to accept a simple lie over a complicated, ugly, and uncomfortable truth. It is to look away from the decades of graft, the gutting of institutions, the ideological destruction of productive capacity, and the resort to the printing press. It is to excuse the very people who systematically dismantled their own country. So the story of Venezuela is not a simple fable about socialism versus capitalism or a straightforward tale of American foreign policy. It is something much more fundamental and much more terrifying. It is a warning. Venezuela's collapse was engineered from within. It was born from a fatal addiction to a single resource which created a political class that saw the state's wealth not as a public trust, but as a treasure to be looted. It was accelerated by policies that, in the name of helping the people, destroyed the country's ability to produce anything. And it was sealed by the oldest economic sin in the book, the belief that a government can print its way to prosperity. By 2025 and 2026, the situation has morphed. The raw hyperinflation has largely ended, partly because the government was forced to abandon its rigid controls just to survive, effectively dollarizing the economy out of desperation. But the damage is done. The country remains trapped in deep poverty, its infrastructure in ruins, and its people scattered across the globe. Even with the capture of Maduro, the path forward is blocked by a mountain of debt estimated at $150 billion or higher, and a system still riddled with the corruption that caused the crisis in the first place. Venezuela is the ultimate proof that a nation's greatest asset is not what it has under the ground, but the soundness of its institutions and the wisdom of its policies.
It proves that no amount of oil can save you from bad money. And this isn't just a lesson for Venezuelans, it's a lesson for all of us. Any nation that becomes too dependent on a single economic driver, that allows corruption to run unchecked, that allows its institutions to be hollowed out for political gain, and that embraces the fantasy of printing money without consequence, is putting itself on the same path. Venezuela didn't collapse because of an external enemy. It was hollowed out from the inside. And that is the blueprint for failure they don't want you to understand. The principles of economic collapse are universal. If you appreciate this approach of following the facts where they lead, do consider supporting my work. I'm an independent analyst, and it's support from my community that makes these videos possible. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.